or would have at least required considerable resources for outreach, flyering, phone banking, etc. on a mass scale. That is the exciting and widely talked about aspect of social media work, which we need to strengthen and make full use of. As revolutionaries who study history, however, we know that mass visibility does not in and of itself lead to revolution. Revolutions are very complicated events in which movements and parties have to be able to, quote, turn on a dime to operate in conditions of legality and illegality. They have to be able to survive the state's sabotage, repression, infiltration, and misinformation. The Leninist party form has been built specifically to withstand state repression. To have a large and national organization that can reorient quickly, move with political and organizational unity, and maintain the same level of discipline as the state, or even higher, communications and publications in Leninist parties have been vertically organized from bottom to top and top to bottom. Maintaining these party internal norms is of maximum importance to defend the organization and preserve its unity in action. Social media poses considerable challenges to the Leninist party form and the broader socialist movement. It creates unlimited potential for horizontal communications between members, for gossip and innuendo in the movement, and for surveillance on members' individual lives, level of political morale and activity, moods, finances, romantic endeavors, etc. It also creates spontaneity in the party's messaging, compared to print publications which are created, produced, and distributed centrally by relevant leadership. Unlike a newspaper, social media allows members to pick and choose which articles they want to distribute, to objectively write their own headlines above the party's headlines, and essentially distribute their own articles, written by themselves or by others without any party discussion and feedback. These challenges do not have easy solutions, but they can be addressed primarily through higher levels of consciousness among comrades about these challenges so that we consciously work together, we consciously build political unity, and we consciously practice democratic centralism. Introduction. Why this document? The amount of time the working class and all of society spends on social media is reason enough for the party to develop best practices and guidelines for its membership. In the span of a few years, it has become the dominant form of media, drawing in literally billions of people worldwide and the vast majority of this country's population. We have already recognized it as essential to all of our organizing work, agitation, and mass communications, but have not yet spoken to its deeper implications or devised an organizational plan and operating guidelines to match. The ruling class is highly focused on social media practices in their business operations and in the field of political organization. The ruling class has strict social media guidelines for its leaders and operatives. It also has thousands of paid people who work day and night to promote their worldview and defend their interests online. They use social media as a powerful tool for their ends. Their operatives are held to professional standards of conduct, and they tailor their messaging with the intent of effectively persuading millions of people to follow them, donate to them, buy from them, vote for them, etc. Professional revolutionaries, as distinguished from amateur revolutionaries, must strive to match this professionalism and, in fact, go beyond it. Our project of social revolution is 1,000 times more difficult and meaningful than their mission, self-promotion, and personal aggrandizement, and thus party members' online conduct must display higher levels of discipline, humility, and coordination. Last but not least, security concerns compel us to take very seriously our conduct on social media, which is by nature public and loose. Social media, a qualitative shift in mass communications. Social media is not just a technological breakthrough. It is a technological shift that has fundamentally and permanently altered social relations in nearly every aspect of life, as well as mass culture and, of course, the means of communication. It is no less significant than the inventions of the printing press, the radio, or television that came before it, and significantly changed the world in their own right. Social media indeed represents a qualitative leap from these forms on account of its horizontal nature. The computer revolution put publication tools at everyone's fingertips. Social media, however, has extended the possibility of mass distribution across geographic boundaries, making the individual a de facto media outlet. This has vast potential for carrying out the party's strategy to popularize socialism, but presents equal challenges to the Leninist party form. It is essential for all revolutionaries to adapt their modes of organization to the times they live in. The party can strengthen itself by creating processes and methods to make the most of social media's potential while also dealing straightforwardly with its built-in challenges. That means both making use of social media's potential for mass communications while at the same time preserving and in fact improving and updating the centralism and quote vertical forms that have proven to be vital for the survival and success of revolutionary organizations. No revolutionary movement can effectively withstand, respond to, and overcome the centralized state without its own quote vertical model based on the accountability of lower to higher bodies and a well-defined chain of command that allows it, as a whole, to rapidly respond to events, take initiatives, and make retreats where necessary. That is the fundamental challenge facing revolutionaries with social media. It facilitates the spontaneous expression of moods, ideas, and even actions, but a movement based on spontaneity and looseness will never defeat the apparatus of the centralized state and the corporate media. Spontaneity and horizontalism. Just as social media can facilitate almost instantaneously radical action and mass optimism, it can in equal measure spontaneously facilitate pessimism and cynicism. A revolutionary idea, event, or image can, quote, go viral and be absorbed momentarily by large sections of the population. A highly useful work of political analysis can take off online and be shared, read, and assimilated in the span of 24 hours among the country's vanguard fighters. This is clearly an important new aspect of organizing in the modern era. But just as easily, these progressive and revolutionary contributions can be and are followed the next day with new viral content that is imprecise, misleading, or downright reactionary. Out of this free-for-all culture of social media, the working class and its most self-sacrificing fighters will not spontaneously arrive at the generalized lessons of the class struggle in all its complexity, nor will it develop the discerning eyes necessary to spot and combat the different shades of bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideology masquerading as, quote, radical from one day to the next. This sort of challenge to provide clarity and coherence out of a confusing, tangled mess of various ideological cross-currents is not new. In fact, the primary task of communists in every era is to weave into the struggles of the working class a far-sighted revolutionary vision and philosophy based on the scientific study of society and history. This has never been simple and easy because bourgeois ideology is always dominant in capitalist society apart from the most exceptional circumstances. That is, the rare moments when the working class en masse comes to the revolutionary conclusion that its future is best secured through the destruction of the existing state. So social media in that sense accelerates, with a flood of non-stop political opinions and information, the general problem that communists always face. The communists of every era have to grapple with the question of what forms of organization and communication best serve this task in their context. This is where the idea of a, quote, collective organizer comes in. The historical development of the collective organizer. In the founding era of Marxism, in which the proletariat was still in the process of formation as a class, revolutionary ideas were initially spread through high-level theoretical tracts and polemics among the radical intelligentsia and a relatively small substrata of literate, advanced workers. Publishing had advanced considerably from previous centuries, but remained expensive and labor-intensive, which limited the capabilities of the new socialist organizations. The primary method to maintain organizational unity among diverse radical collectives in a given country was the speaking tour. The ideas of the organizational center literally traveled and arrived with the lecturer. The Second International witnessed the popularization and also dilution of key Marxist concepts through the rapidly growing and wide-ranging institutions of labor unions and labor parties, aided by the skyrocketing rates of literacy among the urban working class. These institutions produced a mountain of publications, pamphlets, books, newspapers, etc., for a range of audiences. By this point, the evolution of printing technology made the publication process far easier and more accessible for the working class and its organizations around the world. The publications of the Second International period reflected the diffuseness of their organizations, which had multiple tendencies rather than a single political line. The publications contained widely divergent opinions, constituting a larger ecosystem of socialist thought and debate rather than the unified voice of the party or its leadership. Russian Marxists at the turn of the 20th century displayed much of this looseness in their publications and party organization, while also navigating the unique conditions of constant state repression and censorship. Russia in the preceding decades had seen a major strike upsurge as the industrial working class came to life. Although fighting for immediate economic demands, the workers displayed their power to all sectors of society and proved in practice to a generation of radicals that this mass activity, rather than targeted terrorism or a return to the countryside, would be key to the coming revolution. Lenin's "What is to be done" was a polemic against those who believed the party could ride such spontaneous outbursts to a revolutionary breakthrough and defeat the state. His opponents advocated an organizational model where local chapters and collectives retained autonomous newspapers and focused on arousing the proletariat to action with agitation around their immediate economic demands. Lenin envisioned another model based on a different understanding of the relationship between spontaneous and organized activity. In Lenin's view, revolutionary Marxists could celebrate spontaneous activity only as an expression, in embryonic form, of the potential for conscious and directed class struggle. In fact, the purpose of Marxism was to wage a fierce struggle against spontaneity, because without the guidance of socialist ideology and leadership, the working class movement would inevitably fall captive to bourgeois ideology and set its sights on its immediate demands alone. Lenin's concept of maintaining a distinct organization that would introduce revolutionary socialist ideas into the spontaneous workers' movement was not elitism, as anti-communists have long claimed. To the contrary, it was a call for Marxists to stop pandering to the workers and instead draw working class leaders into such an organization of highly dedicated revolutionaries, whose job was to constantly process, synthesize, and respond to the range of political and class struggles taking place around the country. For Lenin, this would take place through a national newspaper, the new, quote, collective organizer. While locally run newspapers could certainly have a place in socialist agitation, the main deficit of Russia's movement was the absence of a national publication to bring out the general political line, demands, and vision of the movement. Localism, in fact, disarmed the activists and workers, narrowed their political vision, and left them unequipped to deal with the complexities of struggle against the state. By engaging dispersed revolutionaries and workers with the same material, involving them in the process of assessment, and providing them in written form with the synthesized experiences of their comrades in other cities, a truly united national organization of revolutionaries could be organized. The newspaper and democratic centralism. With all members bound to a common and central newspaper expressing the organization's political line, they all knew that regardless of one's location, a comrade in another city or town truly shared their vision and organizational model. While the party had always practiced democracy in its meetings, congresses, editorial discussions, and in the election of leaders, including editors, this new type of newspaper form is what introduced centralism in a practical sense. As all local chapters would respond to the instructions of the national newspaper and promote it, the newspaper would provide a means to root out various forms of amateurism and arbitrariness, requiring the discipline of lower bodies to higher bodies, an absolute necessity to build an apparatus that could contend with the hierarchical state and its agents. The cornerstone of Lenin's new organizational form were the cadre members, professional revolutionaries who became experts in class struggle and became forged together through years of common activity and shared sacrifices. Just setting up an underground distribution network for the paper itself was one such shared experience that helped build the organization's professionalism and capabilities. The organization that took shape around Lenin's proposals, the Bolsheviks, indeed developed a unique character compared to the organizational form of the Second International parties. In the revolutionary crises triggered by the mass destruction of World War I, only the Bolsheviks were able to seize and hold power. When the Third International was formed, inspired by the Russian Revolution, its member parties replicated this aspect of the Bolshevik organizational form. The centralized national newspaper, functioning as the voice or organ of the party leadership, was replicated in communist parties around the world. Newspaper technology is well suited for the vertical relationships that characterize democratic centralist organizations. At least until the computer era, printing a newspaper required considerable economic resources, human power, a physical center, as well as well-defined distribution networks. In short, printing and distribution was a major undertaking that required an organization to centralize its collective financial and human resources. Newspaper production, at least when functioning in a healthy way, also included a period of democracy, when articles were discussed, reviewed, and edited by the comrades involved in the work and elected to lead it. Followed by a period of centralism, when the publication was printed and all members were obligated to defend it even if they were not in full agreement with every article. The realities of newspaper printing also had a built-in enticement for individual activists and revolutionaries to join organizations. Given that individuals and small groups could not easily set up their own newspapers, or at least not ones with significant distribution, to be part of a political project with any sort of national visibility required linking up with others. In a way, the radical printing press was practically synonymous with the radical organization itself. That is why state repression was so often directed at shutting down and confiscating independent printing presses. From the attacks on abolitionist presses in the mid-1800s to the attacks on labor unionists in the aftermath of the Haymarket Affair, organizations could be essentially silenced without their presses. In Tsarist Russia, such raids on independent presses were a major impediment to consistent publication, forcing radicals to go through processes managed by state censors. Lenin's national paper, Iskra, helped alleviate the problem by printing abroad. What is our collective organizer? Today, the party's websites and social media pages perform functions that more closely resemble the quote collective organizer than the party's newspaper. When members or other individuals want to know what the party's perspective is on a given issue, they go to these sites rather than waiting for the newspaper. These sites post content far more frequently and centralize the disparate experiences of the class struggle in our branches and around the world. This is not to say the print publications do not play similar roles. The broadsheet newspaper is not the main and central party voice, but it is a centralized tool for outreach and agitation, planned and targeted for the party's direct intervention into developing movements. It provides a common identity and line to our interventions regardless of what city we are in. The books also can play the role of a collective organizer insofar as they can draw large sections of the membership into common study groups and ideological discussions, refining and deepening the distinct political line of our organization. Social media is not naturally a collective organizer. Because the website and social media pages require frequent updating to remain attractive and have no limits for the amount of content they can hold, this undoubtedly introduces certain weaknesses in comparison with the classic, quote, collective organizer of the newspaper. The traditional party newspaper form communicated clear organizational priorities to members and other readers. It makes this clear in what is put on the front page, what is the subject of the editorial, which articles get prominent coverage and which do not. Some of these benefits of the newspaper can be retained within the website form with an appropriate layout and the consistent publication of PSL statements and editorials. The launch of Liberation School helps the party promote those in-depth works of analysis that it wants to feature. But conveying organizational priorities is somewhat harder to do naturally through social media. where posts are simply listed chronologically or based on algorithms we can't control or even fully determine, and are in fact selectively manipulated by major corporations. An article or statement that is highly important to the party leadership and editors may get significantly less attention than one of lesser importance. It may get less attention because its headline is not as snazzy, or its subject matter is not directly related to the current news cycle, the latest quirk in the algorithm, or because our members and readers have less familiarity with it. In the traditional Leninist newspaper as the party's collective organizer, the front page story would be carefully selected. All members would know to read the article that was placed on the front page, and when they went out to distribute it, they would be compelled to explain its importance to others. Moreover, in distributing the paper, they would be distributing all of its articles, not just a few that most appealed to them personally. By comparison, when members today go to our website or social media page, they may skip right past that article, especially if it does not immediately appeal to their personal curiosity or personal interests. They may not distribute or share it simply because they assume their friends will not relate to it. This is a problem. If we do not step up conscious and deliberate methods to counteract these trends, social media can actually impede the ability of the party leadership and publications team to centrally organize the membership through its publications. It can lead to compartmentalization, with certain comrades only promoting articles on certain issues, rather than encouraging unity and a communist attitude towards supporting all struggles of the oppressed. Let's consider another scenario, which in fact is quite common and has political implications that are easily overlooked. Let's say the party has posted an article about a police brutality case where the officer has actually been indicted after a large protest. The article is titled, quote, "People's Struggle Forces Indictment of Killer Cop in New York City," end quote. And this is its emphasis, showing people that protesting can in fact make a big difference. At one place in the article, it also says, quote, "Of course, we should not expect justice from the capitalist courts. The struggle must continue," end quote. Consider if a party member shares the article with the caption, quote, "Don't expect justice in the capitalist courts," end quote. In effect, they have changed the headline and emphasis of the article, contradicting the comrades who developed and decided it in the writing and editorial stages. The organized and accountable process of the party, in this case the publication stage, has been overridden in the last stage of distribution. Or consider if the comrade writes as a caption or tweet, quote, "I'm so tired of protesting about something that should be so obvious," end quote. This is an understandable sentiment, but it has actually flipped the spirit of the original article. Instead of an encouragement to continue the struggle, it reflects exhaustion and discouragement. Probably 9/10 of one's followers and friends will not click on the article itself, even those who like it or favorite it. Has the comrade promoted the party's line or undermined it? There is not an easy and scripted solution to this challenge, but it calls for comrades to be more vigilant and conscientious readers, to truly think through the party's orientation and emphasis in the articles they share. Social media, in short, offers many opportunities for spontaneity to enter into the publications and distribution process, and therefore into the struggle to raise revolutionary consciousness. Because each member can create and instantly distribute content to the movement, the party, and the public, they are in essence a media outlet unto themselves. To overcome the spontaneity and individualism of this, making sure that the organization's publications and political line shine through requires conscious, deliberate, and organized activity. The best safeguard is, of course, to use social media in coordination with other comrades, so that talking points and captions are, even if personalized to a degree, completely consistent and unified. Systems that are easy to censor. An additional reality is that the means of production in social media are privately controlled. They are fundamentally in the hands of our class enemies, who can and will use these powerful tools against the people's movements and to disorient the population, or even pull the plug on social media services entirely if they get out of hand. Such drastic steps can have disastrous consequences for the ruling class. When Hosni Mubarak pulled the plug on Twitter, it enraged larger sections of the Egyptian society and compelled more to go to the protest and see what was going on for themselves. But the major tech companies have now developed, at the behest of governments, sophisticated techniques to censor certain content, and have shown a willingness to shut down profiles and pages that are deemed, quote, national security threats. This suggests that while the party makes the most of the current political, quote, freedom to engage in conventional mass communications through social media and email, it must also study the methods and experiences of contemporary radicals operating in more adverse political conditions. Security issues and vulnerabilities. The security dimensions of social media are of primary importance. The FBI, DHS, NSA, local police agencies, and private security contractors have entire divisions and departments focused on social media intelligence gathering as their full-time jobs. Practically all intelligence gathering operations and a huge amount of prosecutions rely on social media. Because social media is, quote, public, the even nominal constitutional safeguards that exist in other forms of communication are of little utility on social media. These agents can easily create fake profiles, quote, friend people in the party or the movement, and then accumulate vast amounts of intelligence. These agents have a personal and careerist motivation to invent and exaggerate threats, to, quote, find something that can be actionable or put into an intelligence product to impress their superiors. Every member of the party and the movement should conduct themselves on social media with the expectation that their activity there is not private. This is so even for the general populace, but magnified enormously for members of the PSL, an organization that orients itself towards the sharpest points of political struggle in a variety of social movements. There is clear documentary proof, as well as loads of personal experience, that speak to the amount of time and energy police and, quote, counterterrorism agents have used in tracking, infiltrating, and sabotaging the movements that the PSL has been centrally involved in. The anti-war movement, the Occupy movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, etc. That these movements were not engaged in criminal activity and were almost entirely nonviolent is of little consequence to them. When the state investigates or sabotages an organization or movement, what sort of information are its agents interested in? Everything. Above all, they look for personal vulnerabilities, internal weaknesses, and nascent contradictions between members or with others in the movement, which can be exploited. In addition, they are looking for sensational language and imagery that can be distorted and manipulated into a potentially criminal offense, used to justify larger investigations or simply saved to demonize the organization's members at a later point. Here's a scenario. If an intelligence agent goes to an event of an organization and then adds a good deal of its members on Facebook, what could they gather? Once they have added 2 or 3 members, they could soon become friends with the rest, based on their, quote, shared friends. By simply monitoring their pages over a short time, tracking, quote, likes, comments, images, and other activity, just one person could identify 1. Who hangs out with who, effectively mapping the organization. 2. One's personal routine, including regular whereabouts. 3. Who is the most active, who is inactive, who is popular and influential. 4. What issues and struggles matter most to which members. 5. Who is dealing with financial and family problems. 6. Who seems personally frustrated or depressed. 7. Who is politically demoralized. This can be surmised simply by the absence of posts that coincide with the organization's initiatives or indirect passive-aggressive content. 8. Who appears to have, quote, divided loyalties, functioning in a friendly way with individuals who are hostile to the party, for instance, an ex-member who was expelled. Just as a member can easily detect all the above information about the members of our own branches, we can detect it about other branches and others in the movement. So can the state. The reality is that individuals now naturally give away this information about themselves quite freely. There is no simple solution to this problem as long as members use social media. The important thing is to use one's page to project unity, solidarity, and revolutionary optimism, to consistently post articles and events involving the organization, and generally to avoid hints of internal contradictions and personal weaknesses. While many people in society use social media as an online diary, as is their prerogative, all comrades must ask themselves, as a revolutionary, do I want the state to have my diary? Once you are identified as an organizer and revolutionary, everything you say and do, online or in person, will be seen as a representation of your values, your political identity, and the organizations that you represent. While social media has taken media and publications out of the exclusive hands of the bourgeoisie, yielding far more opportunities for poor and working class people to promote and publicize their views, it still promotes petty bourgeois and individualist notions of, quote, private ownership of the content one creates. We must make full use of social media's possibilities while guarding against such sentiments. Like all technologies, social media platforms themselves are not inherently good or bad, or progressive or regressive. Instead, it is the political and ideological context in which they are situated that, to a large extent, condition the limits of their use. By identifying the challenges and opportunities they present, we can most effectively wield their power while not succumbing to spontaneity, losing sight of our organizational norms, or becoming over-reliant on them in our organizing work. Thanks for listening. You can read more at liberationnews.org. You can follow us on SoundCloud, Spotify, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms. And follow us on social media at PSL Web. You're listening to Liberation News, the newspaper of the Party for Socialism and Liberation.
Dual Power, Base Building, and Serving the People in the U.S. Revolutionary Movement by Walter Smolarek. The current period is the most favorable for socialists in the United States in decades. Against the backdrop of the Great Recession, waves of activity around the Occupy movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the Bernie Sanders campaign have produced a profound radicalization in political attitudes across society. Socialism is viewed favorably by close to half of the population, and a substantial section of young people are sympathetic towards communism and Marxism. The key challenge facing revolutionaries in this moment is how to convert this explosion in pro-socialist consciousness into an organized force in society. While this includes the rapidly expanding ranks of new cadre who are dedicating their lives to the cause of socialist revolution, a real organized force in society will draw its strength from the tens of millions of people who suffer the profound injustices of the capitalist system and are searching for an alternative. This base, or potential base, for socialist movement can be found primarily amongst the 140 million poor people in this country. As communists and other radicals across the country grapple with this question, the concept of dual power has rightfully become a topic of considerable interest and debate. However, the working definition of dual power used by organizations and individuals is often so broad and general that it renders the term practically useless. As such, it is important to disentangle the concepts and history bound up in these discussions in order to think clearly about the way forward for those fighting for revolutionary change. Problems in the contemporary debate over dual power in the United States. The bulk of the current debate over the role of dual power in a strategy for revolution in the United States rests on a relatively recent redefinition and decontextualization of the concept, in which it is effectively stripped of its meaning by becoming so broad that it could refer to almost anything. This, in turn, results in the misunderstanding and misapplication of tactics related to directly meeting the needs of the working class, building a base of support, and ultimately making a revolution. The Black Rose Anarchist Federation is among more prominent organizations popularizing this new understanding of dual power. This reformulation of the concept has its roots in anarchist writings on the subject that emerged in the early 2000s in the aftermath of the anti-globalization movement. As an expression of its current position, This organization republished an article last year called Active Revolution, originally written in a 2002 issue of the publication The Northeastern Anarchist. It defines dual power this way. Dual power theorizes a distinct and oppositional relationship between the forces of the state/capitalism and the revolutionary forces of oppressed people. The two can never be peacefully reconciled. But the theory of dual power is a dual strategy of public resistance to oppression, counterpower, and building cooperative alternatives, counter-institutions. Public resistance to oppression encompasses all of the direct action and protest movements that fight authoritarianism, capitalism, racism, sexism, homophobia, and the other institutionalized oppressions. Building cooperative alternatives recreates the social and economic relationships of society to replace competitive with cooperative structures. It's hard to imagine what doesn't fall under such a broad definition. Instead of institutions like Venezuela's National Constituent Assembly or the Soviets of the Russian Revolution that have the capacity to exercise state power, to enforce the rule of either workers and the oppressed or the capitalist class, the power in dual power simply refers to the fact that there are two camps in society locked in conflict with one another. That the interests of the exploited and oppressed are opposite and irreconcilable with the interests of the exploiters and oppressors is no revelation. This is simply a restating of the materialist conception of history. That revolutionaries should participate in politics, the struggle for power in society, is a concept so elementary that it has little utility for those looking for a concrete strategy to pursue. The actions prescribed by this particular approach to dual power are likewise impossibly broad. Two sets of activities are proposed: creating vehicles to wage direct struggle against the ruling class, and carrying out direct services to meet the material needs of working people. The first type of activity is referred to by Black Rose Anarchist Federation as action that, quote, encompasses all of the direct action and protest movements that fight authoritarianism, capitalism, racism, sexism, homophobia, and the other institutionalized oppressions. This could be a group of employees organizing a union at their workplace or going on strike. This could mean a community campaign to hold a police officer guilty of brutality to legal account. It could also refer to residents in an apartment building holding a rent strike, students marching to demand free higher education, or activists holding a sit-in to demand action on climate change. Of course, revolutionaries should organize, but the question of strategy is to determine which of these struggles and tactics, and so many others, have particular social significance, under what circumstances they arise and gain that significance, and for which layers of the population. The other side of the dual power approach encompasses essentially all other types of activities that could possibly be organized by revolutionaries, from community gardens and food drives to crowdfunding campaigns. Beyond the extreme generality of the concept, there is an additional problem embedded in the popular understanding of the purpose of activities meant to, quote, recreate the social and economic relationships of society to replace competitive with cooperative structures. This recreates many of the errors that communists have long pointed out regarding the creation of worker cooperatives as a means of, quote, overcoming capitalism. No enterprise, cooperative, or capitalist produces all of the raw materials, machinery, software, means of transportation, and other inputs necessary for its own functioning. These can only be acquired through commerce with other enterprises, which will rightfully understand efforts to overthrow capitalism as a threat to their own existence. Beyond the barriers of entry costs, scale, and price competition in capitalism, if a cooperative is somehow able to carve out a spot for itself in the broader capitalist supply chain, wouldn't the capitalist state legalize their activities if they ever truly presented a threat to the rule of the capitalist class? In addition, there is nothing inherently radicalizing about having one's needs met. There is a huge complex of non-profit organizations funded by ruling class foundation money, many of which mask themselves with radical-sounding language, that have been established in recent decades to meet the needs of working people, but in a political sense, serve as a means to inhibit the development of revolutionary consciousness. Promoting direct service activities as a form of dual power undercuts the core of the Revolutionary Socialist program. To have a society where people's needs are met, we need to expropriate the capitalist class, smash their state, and establish a worker state in its place.
Dual power in the history of socialist revolutions. To think clearly about dual power, we have to put the concept in its historical and political contexts. Previous generations of revolutionaries have understood dual power as a highly unstable situation in society that lasts for a temporary historical moment. The revolution, the decisive seizure of state power by working class and oppressed, resolves the question of dual power by shattering the authority of the old power and establishing the legitimacy of the new power. Alternatively, a counter-revolution restores the old power in a new form. This concept originates in the Russian Revolution of 1917. In February, the year's first revolution took place, which overthrew the absolutist monarchy. In its place, a provisional government was set up that included representatives of the Russian capitalist class, as well as the more moderate elements of the country's socialist movement. But this was not the only source of authority in society. Parallel to the provisional government, institutions called Soviets emerged, representing the interests of the country's workers, peasants, and rank-and-file soldiers. Lenin labeled this particular situation dual power and elaborated on it in the pamphlet The Tasks of the Proletariat in Our Revolution, written in the period after the February Revolution but before the Socialist Revolution in October. The main feature of our revolution, a feature that most imperatively demands thoughtful consideration, is the dual power which arose in the very first days of the triumph of the revolution. This dual power is evident in the existence of two governments. One is the main, the actual government of the bourgeoisie, the provisional government of Lvov and Co., which holds in its hands all the organs of power. The other is a supplementary and parallel government, a controlling government in the shape of the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies, which holds no organs of state power, but directly rests on the support of an obvious and indisputable majority of the people, on the armed workers and soldiers. This remarkable feature, unparalleled in history in such a form, has led to the interlocking of two dictatorships. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, for the government of Lvov and Co. is a dictatorship, i.e. a power based not on the law, not on the previously expressed will of the people, but on seizure by force accomplished by a definite class, namely the bourgeoisie. And in the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, the Soviet of Workers and Soviets' Deputies. There is not the slightest doubt that such an interlocking cannot last long. Two powers cannot exist in a state. One of them is bound to pass away, and the entire Russian bourgeoisie is already trying its hardest everywhere and in every way to keep out and weaken the Soviets, to reduce them to naught, and to establish the undivided power of the bourgeoisie. The dual power merely expresses a transitional phase in the revolution's development, when it has not gone further than the ordinary bourgeois democratic revolution, but has not yet reached a pure dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. A contemporary example of dual power can be found in Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution. Parallel to the institutions of the bourgeois state, the presidency, the National Assembly, and the Supreme Court, etc., inherited by the revolutionaries after Hugo Chávez's 1998 election victory, there exists a communal state in formation. The basic units of the communal state are the communal councils, which were first formally created in 2006. Steve Elner, a professor at Universidad de Oriente in Puerto La Cruz, explained in a 2009 article. The community councils are horizontally structured with all of their leaders, called voceros, or spokespeople, speaking free of charge and considered of equal rank. Spokespeople can belong to no more than one of their council's various commissions, which include a communal bank, which handles grant money, a social controllership, which monitors spending, and an employment commission, which enlists qualified community members for remunerative jobs and attempts to ensure that they receive preferential hiring. All decisions, including the selection of spokespeople, are ratified in an assembly of citizens, which represents the community council's maximum instance of decision-making. The communal councils are grouped together into federations called socialist communes, which carry out larger-scale projects and develop socially owned productive industries called communal enterprises. The framework for the communes is laid out in the 2010 Organic Law of Communes. Augusto Montiel, then a member of the National Assembly, who now serves as Venezuela's ambassador to India, described the goal of the law at the time of its passage. Quote, "To put an end to the bourgeois state that we still have, we need to create conditions for the development of a community-based, communal, democratic, protagonistic, and revolutionary state. That is, to create a state that doesn't allow power to be concentrated in the hands of a privileged few," end quote. While dual power today in Venezuela and in Russia in 1917 have their own unique characteristics because of the particular historical circumstances they arose out of, there are fundamental common features. Both involve the creation of grassroots decision-making institutions based on the direct participation of the organized working class, which is capable of carrying out the functions of the state. Both emerged as the result of revolutionary situations that radically shifted power in society. As such, in both cases, dual power is highly volatile and involves constant clashes between the competing sources of authority. In Venezuela, this instability reached new heights in 2019 when the Counter-Revolutionary National Assembly backed Juan Guaido's coup attempt against President Nicolás Maduro, who had convened the National Constituent Assembly as the highest expression of revolutionary authority.
Related questions on base building. Direct services activities, what proponents of the new conceptualization of dual power refer to as counter-institutions, do indeed have a great deal of utility. However, the provision of direct service must be understood as a tactic rather than a strategy in and of itself. Alongside the discussion in the socialist movement on the meaning and application of dual power, a related debate has emerged over base building. For revolutionaries, base building refers to long-term efforts to create a durable reserve of support within a particular section of the working class. This is usually constructed on the basis of a workplace or a neighborhood. The provision of services is an important element of base building work, but this needs to be done in a way that does not promote the view that the creation of a vast network of worker-owned cooperatives or activist-administered social programs is a path to power. Properly applied, Serve the People programs are primarily an outreach tactic with the goal of identifying sites of potential class struggle rather than a manifestation of dual power. To consider some practical examples, the Philadelphia branch of the Party for Socialism and Liberation is involved in a number of base-building activities that utilize direct service events along these lines. In May, we organized a block party through our Kensington-based community center called the Philadelphia Liberation Center. At the block party, we distributed bags of household essentials and childcare goods marked with our party logo, and also organized music, children's activities, and a cookout to give neighbors a chance to socialize. Events geared towards meeting residents' cultural and recreational needs can be just as effective as those aimed at meeting material needs, and has the added benefit of attracting in greater numbers the layers of the neighborhood with a baseline level of stability conducive to future organizing efforts. Kensington is being intensely targeted by the big banks and real estate firms for gentrification. We made the right to housing the political theme of the block party, produced a special pamphlet for it, and promoted the event with the framing "Strong communities can resist gentrification." In the course of our outreach for the block party, we met a long-time, well-respected resident of the neighborhood who was fighting the construction of a massive luxury apartment complex on the small residential street where she lived. She invited us to attend an upcoming hearing on the construction, and from there to join the fight on an ongoing basis. The practical commitment to the well-being of people in the neighborhood demonstrated by the PSL's cadre earned the trust of the people, which invited us to intervene on this local issue. From there, we were able to help launch the Norris Square Community Action Network, which carried out a well-attended picket of the construction site and is also moving forward with other projects in the neighborhood. Another practical example involves our work with a community of recently arrived immigrants from Central America. Through a pre-existing contact, we were able to partner with the congregation to set up an after-school program called Escuelita Oscar Romero. This project provides both childcare and educational services to families struggling to survive under the weight of the U.S. government's war on immigrants. Sometime after Escuelita Oscar Romero's launched, the father of one of the participants was arrested by ICE and held for deportation. Because we had already developed a foundation of trust between ourselves and the people, we were able to immediately organize a well-attended meeting that resolved to form an anti-ICE emergency response network to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. We have subsequently held a number of door-knocking sessions along with members of the community to develop a contact list of people who are alerted when ICE is spotted in or around the neighborhood. To build a base, communist cadre first need to insert themselves into the designated workplace or geographic location. Because this is a long-term effort, the reputation of the revolutionaries is of paramount importance. Working people will not follow any group into a struggle in sufficient numbers unless there is pre-existing trust and confidence that is established, and this is impossible to do through rhetoric alone. Direct service activities demonstrate through practical deeds that communists are upstanding members of the community who care deeply for the well-being of the people and sacrifice their time and resources for the benefit of others. Those most excited about these activities tend to be organic leaders in the community who are also the most receptive to struggle-oriented politics. Preparing for the revolutionary crisis. The pressing task of the day for those who seek a socialist transformation of society is not to build dual power, but rather to build a revolutionary party. The capitalist class is able to remain in power despite its microscopic size because it has at its disposal a state staffed by people who are effectively professional counter-revolutionaries dedicated to maintaining the status quo. The only instrument that is historically proven capable of overcoming the entrenched power of the state is a revolutionary party composed of cadre, professional revolutionaries. But a revolutionary party cannot be constructed overnight. The ideological and practical training of its membership, the development of new generations of leadership, the recruitment of the most committed activists from a wide range of social movements is a long and painstaking process. Whether or not the Revolutionary Party has built deep, lasting bonds of trust and confidence with the workers and oppressed is of decisive importance. Independent of the actions of the revolutionaries, a revolutionary crisis in society can and will occur, usually brought about as a consequence of an economic crisis or a war. A revolutionary crisis is a brief period of time when the existing social order is so deeply despised and delegitimized in the eyes of the vast majority of the population that the state can no longer go on ruling in the old way. Under these circumstances, dual power in the true sense of the term can emerge, and the rule of the capitalists can give way to the rule of the people.
Thanks for listening. You can read more at liberationnews.org. You can follow us on SoundCloud, Spotify, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms. And follow us on social media at PSL Web.
States around the country have passed and are passing laws that make it illegal to engage in or advocate for the boycott of the apartheid government in Israel. Filmmaker Abby Martin fought back against these laws. She said they violated the Constitution and the cherished right to free speech, and she won. Today we'll talk about this landmark battle for free speech and the First Amendment. We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Welcome to The Real Story on the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. We bring you independent programming 3 days a week, every week. If you enjoyed this show, if you support independent media, become a patron of our program by going to patreon.com/The Socialist Program. Become a subscriber today. We are happy to be joined by filmmaker Abby Martin and constitutional rights attorney Mara Verheyden-Hilliard. Abby Martin produces invaluable video and podcast resources through the Empire Files. Check out her work at theempirefiles.tv and their Patreon at patreon.com/Empire Files. Mara Verheyden-Hilliard is the executive director of the Washington, D.C. based Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, PCJF, and she is also the director at the Center for Protest, Law, and Litigation. Abby, Mara, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Glad to be with you.
Thank you so much. This is big. I mean, welcome news, especially coming in the middle of this global uprising in support of the Palestinian people in the wake of another round of Israeli bombing of Gaza and forcible evictions of Palestinian people from their homes. I want to read a press release that was issued by the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund and the Council of American Islamic Relations National Legal Team about your case, Abby, and then I want to get your comment. And Mara, as the attorney, I want to get your view about what this means for constitutional rights and free speech going forward. Here's from the press release issued earlier this week. In an order released today, Judge Mark Cohen ruled that the University System of Georgia violated journalist and filmmaker Abby Martin's constitutional rights when it canceled her speaking engagement on a college campus because she refused to sign a state-mandated oath pledging not to engage in boycotts of Israel. Martin is a well-known advocate of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions BDS movement against Israel, which the court ruled is protected by the First Amendment. Abby Martin, you won. Let's just talk about what actually happened, what happened in Georgia with your speaking engagement, and why you chose to file this lawsuit.
Absolutely. I was supposed to give a speech at a media literacy conference in Georgia, at Georgia Southern University, which is a state-affiliated institution, back in February of 2020. And it wasn't even about Palestine. It was just about critical media literacy in general. I was told that in order to receive an honorarium as an independent contractor, I must sign a pledge to not boycott Israel. I was completely appalled that I was asked to basically renounce my political beliefs in order to work, forfeit my constitutional rights in order to work in the state of Georgia. And so I refused. The conference fell apart and I felt completely demoralized. I didn't know what to do about it. They kind of ghosted me, the organizers, and they just never responded to me again. And so I just put it out there on Twitter, knowing that something deeply wrong had happened, but I didn't know what to do about it. And so I was contacted by CARE about how we had a legal case here. And then knowing Mara and all of her excellent work with PCJF, I linked up with her and added her to the case. And she's a powerhouse. It was incredible to have these two entities working together to launch this lawsuit. And so we basically decided to sue the state of Georgia in March of 2020. And what I think is really interesting is just days after filing the lawsuit, Netanyahu basically boasted that his Ministry of Strategic Affairs had lobbied state legislatures to pass these laws. It seemed to directly respond to the lawsuit because it was really days afterward. And he went on Twitter just saying, whoever boycotts us will be boycotted. We've worked really hard to pass these laws across the US. And I can't help but think just replacing the word Israel with Russia, how outrageous and beyond the realm of possibility that seems to actually have to sign a contract to pledge fealty to Russia and then have the Russian president take to Twitter and basically brag that he had helped pass these laws across the US. So it's just astounding that a foreign nation, has done this and really openly, committed this direct interference that we're told Russia has done against our sacred democracy here. So we sat on this case for, a year and a half, and COVID stalled it. And it was just incredible news and absolutely thrilling news to get this verdict on the heels of this vicious onslaught against Gaza, because I don't know if it has anything to do with the verdict, but it just couldn't be better timing to really push this movement forward and pursue the urgent task of boycott, divestment, sanctions.
Mara Verheyden Hilliard was one of the attorneys on the case. Mara, as I mentioned, is the executive director of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. Mara, in the press release that your organization and CARE put out, you mentioned that the court relied heavily on the case NAACP versus Claiborne, which you also identify as the Supreme Court's landmark decision protecting the right to boycott. Talk about the significance of the case and also a little bit more about that case, NAACP versus Claiborne.
Well, this is, as Abby and you are saying, a major victory and a really important one, particularly at this moment in time when so many people across the United States are looking at what is happening to the Palestinian people and trying to understand what they can do to stand up for justice. And with the massive racial justice demonstrations sweeping across the United States, there's really a new level of consciousness now in terms of the right of oppressed people to be able to stand up for themselves and to throw off oppression. And the BDS movement is in the time-honored tradition of peaceful, non-violent, First Amendment protected political activity. When you think about, for example, the Montgomery bus boycotts, you think about Cesar Chavez and the farm workers' great boycotts, and of course the boycott of apartheid South Africa, these have been very central moments of movement organizing in the United States that reached a broader population, brought people into a struggle in a way that many people can participate, and actually changed the dynamic, changed what was happening on the ground. And what Georgia did is in 2016, it passed this law which restricted anyone who was contracting with the state of Georgia in their First Amendment, their lawful, their protected, constitutionally protected activity, and says that if you contract with the state of Georgia, then you have to sign basically a loyalty oath saying that you agree you will not engage in any boycott of the country of Israel, and that if you are so engaged, you would have to renounce it. You would literally have to renounce your views. So not only is this a restriction on your First Amendment right to engage in lawful political First Amendment protected boycott activity, but it's also compelling speech. It is the state telling someone what they must say, telling them what they must express. And these are among the reasons that the law was ruled unconstitutional by the judge this past week. The case that you're referring to, Claiborne Hardware versus NAACP, that was a seminal case in the Supreme Court, and it grew out of the boycotts of racist business owners in the South, where there were extensive boycotts going on, and there were many different people participating in them, different groups, different organizations, because of the breadth of it. And this company, Claiborne Hardware, sued the NAACP, challenging them, saying that the boycott was unlawful. And the case took a long time to wind through the courts. And these boycotts were going on in the 60s. This case was decided, I think, 1982, finally. But in that seminal Supreme Court case, the court acknowledged that boycott activity is itself a First Amendment protected activity. And that is crucial to understand. And that was really what was being challenged here, because the state of Georgia was saying that Claiborne did not apply.
Abby, why were you going to speak at the University of Georgia? What was your talk about that day?
Well, that's what's so fascinating about this, Brian, is that my talk was just about critical media literacy and just educating people about media. I had no intent to even talk about Palestine. And I think that that really shows you the crux of the problem here, is that it's beyond what you're actually intending to do. This applies to all independent contractors that are just contracting with the state. So, for example, when Hurricane Harvey happened, I remember in Texas, that was a shocking story that arose out of that independent contractors contracting with the state of Texas were given these loyalty pledges that they had to sign in order to get hurricane relief funding from the state. I mean, it's just wrap your mind around that. It doesn't matter if you're a substitute teacher contracting, if you're a construction worker, or if you're an emergency relief like aid worker. You know, in my case, I was receiving an honorarium from a state university. But this applies to tens of thousands of people are signing these contracts across the United States. This is happening in more than 24 states across the country. And people are just signing away their First Amendment rights without even really realizing it, I think, because a lot of people don't read these contracts. And this is just such a chilling effect, which I think is the main intent behind these laws. I mean, they know that BDS is inevitably going to mount a pressure campaign, and we're already seeing that take hold across the world. But we know that Israel has done this preemptively. They have worked tirelessly to do this. We saw Netanyahu brag about that himself, but tirelessly to pass these restrictive measures, A, to create a chilling effect against pro-Palestine speech, but B, because they want to preemptively nip in the bud the growing movement of justice that they know will basically hold them accountable inevitably for their crimes, Brian. And I am thrilled at the judge's decision here. It was the right decision, and now we're waiting to see what will happen in terms of the Georgia State Legislature, if they're going to appeal this or not, because we also know that over the last year, an Israeli consulate official and another direct foreign interference measure came to the Georgia State Legislature and actually tried to change the law to render my case moot. So they have very clearly attempted to maintain the law on the books. So it's going to be very interesting to see what they decide to do moving forward, and if there is a difference of opinion there, and then what that will mean for the case.
This is obviously not the end of the story. It may not even be the end of this particular case, depending on what the state of Georgia does. But let's just help the audience also understand how things actually work in terms of people's rights and the sort of evolution, or in some cases, the devolution of law, or law granting or depriving people of rights. There's always a case that sets a precedent, and then there's a continuing battle in the courts at different levels. Ultimately, it's not only about what happens in the courtroom, it's also about what happens in the community, in the neighborhoods, in the street, in the media. In other words, the courts are not immune from politics. But what will happen now with this case, because as we've been talking about, it's not just Georgia, it's in many other states. And you're also been working a great deal on the political efforts by reactionaries, by especially Republican state legislatures, and others to criminalize dissent, to create new laws that inhibit free speech. Anyway, in the big trajectory here, what comes next with this case, and how significant? Is this the precedent-setting case? Will this be sort of the landmark case in this free speech fight?
Right now, there are approximately 35 anti-BDS laws or executive orders that have been passed across the country. And they take the form of either, a governor's executive order or a legislature passing a law. And they tend to be either that they are restricting contractors, as in Abby's situation, and saying, if you are going to get paid by the state with any state funds, you have to sign this loyalty pledge. Or they sometimes also operate with restrictions on where the state will put any investment funds, that they will not invest in any funds or entities that participate, or that those entities have to swear that they will not participate in any boycott actions. So we're seeing these laws, which are clearly an effort to suppress speech, to suppress organizing, to suppress a movement for change, at the same time, as you mentioned, as the anti-protest laws that are being enacted in rapid fire across the country. These laws have been being enacted now for several years, but interestingly enough, just in the period after the right-wing fascist insurrection attempt, an attack on the Capitol, we saw more and more of these laws being enacted by the right wing but intended to suppress progressive movements. And these are anti-protest laws that seek to criminalize nonviolent, peaceful protest, lifting liability for drivers that run over protesters, that create these heightened penalties for nonviolent classic civil disobedience, turning them into massive felonies that sometimes have huge fines, including fines that try and reach any entity or person who's accused of supporting, even in a lawful way, anyone else who then ends up being criminalized under these laws. I mean, the reach and the expanse is huge. And I think we have to look at all of these in a global framework to understand what's happening, which is you can see the effect of, as we know historically in the United States, of movements in the streets and what causes change in our society, which is always people on the move. It's people in motion. It's people taking action. And over the decades, the Supreme Court, moving with the consciousness of society, increasingly ruled in favor of First Amendment rights, recognizing permutations of First Amendment rights, acknowledging the right and the need of the people to be in the streets, in the sidewalks, in the parklands, from the labor struggles through the civil rights era, through the anti-Vietnam War era. And now there's this shift that's taking place in these other areas, these other branches of government, to try and restrict the ability of people to speak out, to try and shut down the movement by other means. And that's really what we're seeing across the board here.
I want to stay with you, Mara, real quick before I go back to Abby. This seems like the pendulum going back and forth throughout American history, and it's always a consequence of people fighting. I'm looking at a document. I was sort of researching how free speech was restricted at different points. In the time period, in the decades just prior to the Civil War that ended slavery, in these same southern states like Georgia, in response to an overwhelming submission of petitions to the U.S. House of Representatives in support of abolitionist legislation, the government was able to actually pass laws in these states that made it illegal, punishable as a criminal offense, to advocate for the end of the enslavement of human beings. And again, this was just prior to the Civil War that eventually ended, at least legally, slavery, except, of course, for incarcerated people. Anyway, real quick comment from you, and then I want to go back to Abby and ask her a little bit more about how Israel and why Israel views BDS as such a threat.
The idea of democracy, something that we all appreciate and fight for and want to see true democracy, is based on the idea that the people are heard, that the people have the ability to speak. And when you see these laws and like what you're talking about before the Civil War and what we see every time there is a resurgence or a surge of people who are looking at society as it is, or looking at U.S. foreign policy as it is, and saying, this is not acceptable to us. And we as a people, as the American people, are going to stand up and struggle peacefully, nonviolently, whatever it takes to make a difference. Then you have these repressive measures that are completely undemocratic. They are the opposite of democracy, to try and punish and suppress any movement for justice. That's what's happening. And I want to just add quickly one point to what Abby was saying earlier, because it's factually really important for people to conceptualize what happened in Georgia. There was actually a representative from the Israeli consulate who was present in the committee room when they were making deliberations and proposals about this law. And a representative actually pointed them out and said that they were consulting with them. So you have elected state representatives openly saying that they're consulting, taking direction from a foreign power. That is just not something that I would think that most people in the United States would tolerate from any government under any circumstances. And yet that's what's going on here.
Really, really amazing when you think about it. I mean, the whole first 3 years of the Trump presidency was taken up by the Democrats going nuts over the fact that they argued that Russia, through a troll farm in St. Petersburg, had interfered in the American election process such that we had Donald Trump as president. And even though there were unfounded claims, the idea of foreign interference in American politics would be pretty much considered verboten, and certainly under these circumstances of the last couple of years, really raising red flags, Abby. But the idea that Israel could send its representatives to directly and openly interfere in the political process in the United States, it's kind of like, hey, that's cool.
Well, especially when you have this constant noise being generated from the conservative media machine and, so-called conservative martyrs who are saying we are the victims of cancel culture. And, free speech, this outcry over free speech, when really, what is the cancel culture in this country? What laws exist that actually suppress and restrict certain types of speech? We're not talking about heckling people on college campuses, right? Or Twitter banning Donald Trump. We're talking about state laws that restrict and ban certain types of constitutionally protected free speech. And that is why this is so important, because this is unmatched. This is the fight right here of free speech in this country. This is the most criminalized and policed speech there is pro-Palestine speech. That is why this fight is crucial. That is why we need to push this forward, and hopefully this case can be used as a vehicle, as an inspiration for many more plaintiffs to challenge these laws. I have been working on pro-Palestine advocacy for the last 10, 15 years of my political career. I am very passionate about social justice and anti-racism, and this is a deeply held moral belief of mine. And I've explicitly advocated and encouraged BDS throughout that time because I'm taking a cue from the Palestine Solidarity Movement. I'm taking a cue as an American white ally of what I can do as a child of the empire. And BDS is what we've been called to do. We know it works. We know it works from Mara's historical examples. We know that boycotts are what has brought down racist institutional injustices before, not only in this country, but around the world. We see BDS campaigns mounting around the world. We see divestment campaigns working. We're not talking about sanctioning, food and medicine from Israelis like the US empire does to Venezuela. No, this is about political isolation. This is exactly what we're calling, similarly to what happened in South Africa, where you can't go anywhere. If you have an Israeli passport, you're not welcome into academic conferences or concerts and stuff like that. And similarly, if you are an American artist, you're going to be shamed if you go and participate in this apartheid regime and profit off of it. The government of Israel knows this very clearly. They are trying to hold back the tide of justice. They know that public consciousness is on fire. They know they are at a breaking point. They know how important that mindset is in order to maintain their status quo, in order